Indeed, a very good afternoon to everyone here. Excellent to begin the session immediately after your lunch. This was a challenging time, right? It's either a graveyard shift or the post-lunch shift I have right now. And the topic I'm going to talk about is a Singapore story. I'm going to tell you a bedtime story. But rest assured, don't worry, if you fall asleep, I'll try to wake you up. If not, at the end of the session, I will conclude again where the Singapore story is heading. Essentially, when asked to speak, I was looking at the key issues facing the market at a point in time. We talk about the population white paper, how is that going to pan out and affect the property market. I think, in a nutshell, we know property is a derived demand market. It's derived from demand from people. When population rises, naturally there'll be effect on the property prices movement. What you need to know is underlying fundamentals, things that change from point A to point B, where the market fundamentals may shift, demographics may change, and how does that may impact the way the property cycles behave. I think that's what I'm trying to relay to you today. So before I plunge to that, of course, we all know very well that the key market trends for the last few quarters, property price has increased about 0.6% in the most recent ERA release data for first quarter of 2013. This is a marked slowdown compared to the previous quarter. Previously, it was 1.8. So definitely, to some degree, the effect of the policy, the seventh policy, has some measurable impact in the way the property price index has moved. Now, as far as the market is concerned, outside central region, your mass market particularly, was a key driver, about 1.4, slower than the 3.8 we saw in the previous quarter. New sales volume has also slowed down to about 3,000 compared to 4,000 and 9,000 a year ago and 4,004 just a quarter ago. And finally, foreign buyers have slowed down. Foreign buyers, including PRs, have decreased, 29% island-wide and 13% in the last quarter-on-quarter comparison. So now you can go to bed now. If you're sleepy, go ahead. I'll wake you up at the end of my presentation. So really, the crux of my discussion, really, I'm looking at where's the residential demand? What's happening? Is that a need or is that a want? You know, we know what we want, right? We need food to survive, but we don't really want an additional car. Maybe we do want an additional car, but it's not really a need. You don't need an additional car. You have one already. So is that a need or is it a want? Where's the market heading as far as that's concerned? Is it driven by a need or is it driven by a want? And then we look at where is the market heading? Not in terms so much of property price movement, but the fundamental. Remember I talked about in the beginning that we try to look at the market fundamentals, the demographics, the economics part of it. What's happening in there? Take a look at, review the veil, look at the inside and see where property market may head. And finally, we look at some of the measures, some of the pro-population policies that we have. It's really about 6.9 million. It's not just a number. It's more of a planning parameter, not a target. This is a message that I'd like to just emphasize on towards the end. And finally, what is the overall impact on the property market? And that's where I'll bring in recent studies on the bidirectional effect between hinterland and the city. We all know very well that city grows on the back of cheap labor and cheap production costs, right? As you see, emerging markets of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, these are cheap production locations. And cities grow on the back of that. As it grows and matures, there is a reverse. It supports the growth of the hinterland. And here I'll discuss about the issue facing Singapore. Boring, right? Oh, no. No worries, I'll try and make it as entertaining as I can, sort of dancing on the platform here. I'll show you some graphics. Lots of exciting graphics, I like to think. We all know Singapore, 5.3 million people. Of that, 1 out of 4 is a foreigner. In fact, we are all foreigners, in fact, right? We are all formerly immigrants to this land. So basically, right now, 1 out of 4 is a non-resident Singaporean. Of that, 1.2 million in their housing stock. We have a breakdown of about 3/4, slightly more than 3/4, 78% in the public housing, and the remaining just under 1/4 is public housing, private housing. In comparison to Hong Kong, we have private about 50%, and the public another 50%. And of that, of course, public housing in Hong Kong is again broken down into to rental and for sale. And their rental market is a lot bigger than ours. In Singapore's context, you notice that our Singapore's public housing, just under 5% is for direct rental, compared to Hong Kong, it's about 30%. And the remaining here in Singapore, 95%, are sold to the citizens and residents. In the private housing market itself, it's fairly small, just under 1/4 of the total housing stock. And of that, just another 5% of the total housing stock is landed, house with a yard, as we all know, right? Landed properties, we all favor that. So it's a very small market. Likewise, even the prime districts of 9, 10, 11 just takes up 25% of that remaining stock, which means it's just about 3 to 4% of total housing stock are in the private sector in the prime districts of 9, 10, 11. So it's fairly small in terms of overall market. Hence, you understand and see why that the public housing movement, any shivers, any shakeups in there affects the private market as much. But yet, when we talk about the market, we keep focusing on this very small market of less than 25%. So what's happening in this market? Is it a need or is it a want? I think we know the story very well, that over the last, I'll say, 6 to 7 years, population grew on the back of new immigration, whereas our housing stock lagged behind. If you look at the public housing stock, it grew about 15%, while the resident population, you and I and PRs here, grew about 17%. So basically, public housing just kept fairly at pace with the public housing demand, whereas in the private market, private housing grew 44%, while foreign population increased by over 98%. This is starting from year 2000 to today, 2012. Of course, as the time goes on, that number, the index would change. So don't fault me if you hear me again a year later and I tell you the numbers changed, and that's because this is a moving index. I'm looking at 2000 to today. So that number would change as more supply comes into the market. That growth in housing stock will rebalance itself. So as a result of this very strong growth in population, what happened? Well, the household size, that is the average number of person per housing unit, grew. Back in 2000, we had 4.2 person living in a household. By 2012, it expanded to about 4.4. Now, bear in mind, this number that I've shown you here is derived from the SingStat, but I have added a lot more information in there. This is not exactly the same as SingStat. If you look into the SingStat, Singapore Statistics, you'll find that the numbers is 3.7. Why is that so? Because SingStat looks at it from Singapore residents, local residents population, whereas what I've done here, I've taken the entire population base, that is 5.3 million, cut them up into different groups, students, dormitory workers, and so on and so forth, and give them a certain measurements, how many persons per household, and aggregated them at the national level. So this number is slightly different from what you read in SingStats, so bear that in mind. But nonetheless, it shows the same trend that has grown to about 4.4. So just bear that in mind for right now. So consequentially, of course, as we know, property price moved upwards. Now, what is this chart here? Very colorful. Allow me to take a little bit of time to explain to you. The gray bar measures the supply, the balance of demand and supply at that point in time, at that quarter in time. The red bar is cumulative. That means when there is a lack of supply, it accumulates. So the red bar will grow bigger each time, right? So below the horizon, or below this bar, hang on. Can you see my little red dot there? Right, just below the origin, the line here, that means negative, lack of supply. There's cumulative demand in here, whereas above the line means there is excess supply. There's supply meets demand, and in fact, in excess of it. So cumulatively, assuming that starting from 2000, I'm assuming that before 2000, the market was in balance. Starting with 2000, we had a slight shortage, right, cumulatively, so red bar and gray bar is the same. By 2001, there is a bit more supply than demand. So of course, cumulatively, the cumulative demand is removed, slightly lower than this amount, and it continues over time. right? As the gray bar increases, it takes away the cumulative pent-up demand, we call that, and now there is excess supply in the market, and it works itself out. The key message here is, if you notice that over time, of course, the bar goes up and down, depending on supply conditions, the property market behavior, the property price index, does not respond to just supply alone. Typically responds to external shocks. So look at tech stock bubble here. In fact, during the cumulative excess supply situation, the market just remained fairly flat. In fact, starts to pick up here due to economic growth, and then corrected. It coincided here with the lack of supply. It corrected here because of global financial crisis, and it went on flat and growing again. Right, so basically, the take-home message for you here is that the property market behaves a lot of levels. It's not just on demand and supply conditions, but also on external factors. In this case, sentiment-driven. You have the tech stock affecting the market behavior. So what will happen in 2015, 2016? We know there's large supply that's coming in. Will the market correct? Will the market continue to grow? It depends. At the end of the day, it depends very much on this interaction. Is there shock to the system? Where's the demand supply in relation to the external economy? It's good at telling you, not telling you at all, right? Basically telling you, I don't know what will happen. It's basically a lot of factors at play. So don't just go think that, oh yeah, the supply is going to be large, therefore market will correct. Not necessarily. As a result of this very strong market growth over this period, the government adopted what I call a soft policy era. Back in 1995 to about 2005, I call that the hard policy era. Just one single stone, it lands down to the market, it corrects the market. Now it's just little small pebbles, as Deng Xiaoping would say, feel the pebbles as you go along. As you cross the river, feel the pebble. Exactly what's the same thing. You throw in little policies, you tighten them as you go along. How would I describe this market today? For those of you who like 4D, right? I think it's 7351. 7351, what is that? 7 policies over a 3-year period. On average, takes about 5.1 months between policies. That is the frequency that we have. Oh, I know, terrible, so lame, right? So I'm trying to keep awake during lunch. So 7351 is how I describe the property market here today. It's a soft policy era. It's trying to measure how the market responds in reaction to these policies. In the past, with just single boulders, single hard policy, the market corrected average 2.5% per quarter. Whereas right now, with this soft policy, it's managed to slow it down to about averaging about 1.8% growth per quarter. And I think that is somewhere, in my opinion, somewhere between 1 to 1.5 is what the state is comfortable in letting the market continue to expand that way. You must allow for expansion. You must allow for inflation issues. You must allow also for economic growth. But anything that is too far out, too heated, then it may derail the property market and derail the overall market as a result. So somewhere where we are right now, the policy is just about balance. It's soft policy. It manages from two angles, both from your supply as well as price. So the price I've showed you is about 1.8. In terms of the demand, you notice that this soft policy, oops. Oh no, my slides are all missing. What's happening? Actually, I'm supposed to have all these little beautiful orange lines here, but it's not showing up. Is anything wrong with the slide? Yeah, something's missing. My apologies. So something's not showing up here, but just imagine with me now, these are all filled by orange bars. And the different policies were introduced at different points in time to quell the demand in terms of the new launches and take-up. Never mind that. We just move on to the next slide. So we know very well, yes, supply is going to come in. It's going to rebalance eventually. The government is on the 7th policy. It's still watching. If anything's too fast, it may tighten further, as it has done in the past 6 times. Then where are we heading in terms of overall market? Looking deeper into the demographics of it, what's happening? I'll paint 2 scenarios for you for the next perhaps another 20 minutes or so. I will paint 2 scenarios. Scenario 1, where there is very low population growth, essentially based on your own domestic population only. And the other scenario is where we have some external injection to support the dependency ratio. I'll explain all that shortly. Now, assuming the very first case, where there's very low immigration or no immigration at all, just depend on domestic population, we'll find that housing stock, as mentioned earlier, just give me a second. Murphy's Law, right? When things go wrong, it all goes wrong. So it's supposed to be animated. I'm so excited to show you animations, but I can't keep you awake anymore. Okay, so I'm going to have to dance on the stage. Well, imagine that the graphics are all moving for you. Basically, the supply situation is fixed, right? Because all these are projected to complete. The projects are ongoing. Yeah, maybe there'll be a slight delay if demand is not there, but by and large, you can take this as given. Public housing will grow over to from now to then to 2015. In fact, this is my measurement. Population, if we do not have immigration right now, assuming that it just depend on domestic population, indigenous population, then resident population will increase just about 2%, which means there is... Okay, thank you. Here we go. Where were we? Yes, so the population now, the stock will continue to grow. Population, just 2%. Foreign population, we assume that it's 0, which means with this very low population growth, housing stock could potentially exceed what the population demand. You rebalance, but it may have slight marginal surplus. And what happens in that situation? Well, naturally, your household size will shrink, right? The fewer people, housing stock more or less balances out. In fact, it balances. This will bring itself back down by 2015 to about 4.0. And 4.0, you might estimate, is about the long-term average. So 4.2, 4.0, depending on which scenario you're looking at. 4.0 is about the long-term average that we've seen. Pulling it a long-term 10 years, the household size is about 4.0. So you just about balance out. But however, the trick is there's an underlying issue at play here. Oh, finally, there's animation. I'd like you to focus on what we call the demographic dividend. What are these? These are population, the people that are economically active. And see, most of you here are economically active. You look very young, right? It's between the age of 15 to 65. So legally speaking, our retirement age is 65, right? So anytime beyond your retirement age, some countries are 60, so in Singapore it's 65, and the start age is 15. So this group here, you notice the lighter pink bar I'll show you, it means the further away from a time horizon. The darker red is 2010. So in 2010, you find that this is what we call our demographic, economically active population at that point in time. As we move on in time into 2020, 2015, you notice that the population starts to age, right? You find that those 40, 45, 55 starts to rise, as you expect. The cohort from this group, over 5 years later, they'll move up. They'll age, right? And that situation continues. And you notice that as we go further into the time horizon, into 2013, it's getting heavier on this side here, especially the retirees, which means your economic active group, which is all these little small pink bars, the drag on them, the burden on them gets heavier and heavier as we progress over time. As Singaporeans ages, the drag on the economy gets larger because of this aging population. So you can see it graphically. This is just using our own fertility rate and our own mortality rate and projecting forward. And this is what you see eventually in about 10 to 20 years' time. So this kind of situation adds a load on the economically active people. That means this demographic dividend group, they have to shoulder the heavier burden of the retirees. The state will have probably shrinking income level to support the retirees in terms of healthcare and other issues, such as healthcare, transportation issues, all that has to change. So in terms of economic growth, there will be a drag if this situation continues. So these, for those of you who, like me, who likes to geek out and look at text, Now, this essentially trying to explain to you what I just described. The demographic dividend, right, is the condition where the growth of your economic active group, that is those between 15 to 65, exceeds your dependent. So there are probably more of you working out there than the young kids, less than 15 years old, who are in school, and the retirees. So you're able to shoulder that burden. Because of that, you're able to contribute to the economy, you have positive growth. And you've seen that in Singapore over the last 20, 30 years. Because of our low fertility rate, right now about 1.2, is below replacement. The average is about 2.1, right? You need to have replacement. The female has to produce 2.1 to have a replacement of the population, but that's right now we're below that. So this challenges the future economic growth going forward, because these economic active groups that I showed you in the blue box will continue to shrink because not enough of them are coming into the market. If you look at ourselves, compare ourselves with other economies globally, looking at the same demographic issues, but looking at it from a dependency ratio, that is the number of young kids, less than 15, and those who are older than 65, per 100 working adults. So for every 100 working adults, there's 56 in Japan, dependents on them. So it's almost half, right? So you're shouldering another person with you in there. And of course, you find that the mature economies, they're much heavier, about 50, whereas the younger ones, Singapore and Hong Kong, it's just about 30, 35%. Per every 100 working adults, you have 35% that is kind of following you or hovering over you, you're carrying them. That factor may change, like I mentioned earlier. If we depend just on domestic population, you'll find that, oh, exciting now, my charts are coming back alive. The DGP growth per capita is the one in gray, and the red bar is your dependency. As the dependency shrunk, you notice that at the same time, right, from a fairly high period of 50, it moved down over time. Economic growth rose, but critical is here right now. What happens, what policy we adopt will have implications. Some implication is my opinion. There will be some implication on where these economic growth will head. Will there be a drag on the economy? Can there be other measures introduced? Take it differently. Same thing again, looking at this chart now. These are your dependents. These are the working adults. As you notice, working adults will shrink over time. Dependents will start to rise. Shrinking population, not enough to enter the market. So in fact, these measurements here is for every worker that enter the workforce from here into here, how many are leaving the market? So 2010, you have 0.4 people leaving the market for every new worker that enters the workforce. By 2030, for every person that enters the market, you have 1.64 person leaving the workforce. So you can see the kind of drag you have on the economy as a result of just our own domestic population alone. So in the short term, what can it do? Well, in the long term, of course, we can raise our productivity, as we all know about. States government talking about restructuring, increase productivity, because we need to. For every one of us out there working, we need to improve our productivity. That's assuming the economic growth is what we're driving for. Increase productivity, encourage fertility. It's not like every one of us want to reproduce, right? Because it's known that in urban environment, the fertility rate tends to drop. This is a side effect of urbanization. If you look across the world, in most cities, the fertility rate will fall in direct relation to how fast you grow in terms of economic growth. There is such a correlation, but nonetheless, we have to encourage fertility, delay the retirement age. So maybe you work to 85. Sorry, dear, you've got another 20 more years to go. And last but not least, is to import labor, quickly support the growth. Otherwise, you will have heavier burdens on the shoulders. So these are some of the measurements that have to be taken into consideration. And one of them is pro-population economic growth policies and strategies. So Singapore adopts, in addition to all these policies, right, we need to adopt a pro-population economic growth, given that our fertility rate is below replacement at 1.2. At the same time, we need to increase the economically active population through where possibly delayed retirement or rehiring of the retirees back into the workforce, encouraging or increasing the female participation. We're not doing too bad on that front. And of course, immigration. These are just some of the considerations, some of the policies that are being considered, as we know. And this is to prevent this demographic dividend that I showed you, that blue area, from shrinking too quickly, and they may affect the overall growth in the economy. So then, the next scenario is, if we were to provide enough immigration so as to not put a drag on you and I, that means the dependency ratio. Earlier on, I showed you the chart, 35%, right? For every 100% working, we have 35% behind you, hovering over your shoulders, telling you what to do. If you keep to that number, then we need about 40 to about 100,000 new residents per year, either through immigration or through fertility or through expansion of your workforce by delayed retirement. Because if you not do that, you notice that our demographic dividend will shrink by about 10% by 2030, and that's even below what we saw back in 1980. So this is a situation that we are faced as a nation, as an economy. That's what we are faced with right now. So if that's the situation, if you just have enough people, between 40,000 to 100,000 new residents, to put into the economic active group, what will happen? In my scenario, so public housing, 9%, population grows about 2%, okay, give and take, it's still about balance. Private housing, 21%, and foreign population growing about 15%, keeping in check, keeping in balance. So overall, we're maintaining almost at equilibrium where we are today. Or back in 2000, 4.2%, 4.2 per person per household. So the scenario then is, what happens, in summary, if we maintain our 2010 dependency ratio of 35, then housing market is likely to maintain equilibrium because we're going to hit about averaging 4.2. In the second scenario, if we do not have limited population growth instead, then they could result in some surplus housing because housing stock would just hit about 4.0, just marginally. And what's the impact on the market? Well, again, you have to take a pinch of salt with what I'm putting out here because this is just based on, as I say, ceteris paribus, everything holds constant, no change, right? So property market may likely behave between 1.3 to 1.5% because of policy measures as well. I think that if you're likely to maintain between these two rates per year, if we are to keep that population, this is what the prices may move. But of course, if any external shocks to the system or new things added into the equation, that rate may change. At the end of the day, I think, like I mentioned at the beginning, property is a derived demand. So when population rises, naturally the demand will rise, and property investments and property buyers will increase, right? So naturally the price will reflect that when supply doesn't meet demand. All the equations goes into the picture. You know the answer already. You don't need me to tell you that, yeah, property price may move if population increase. The issue is how much can increase. What other issues are there you need to be aware of? And for that, it is, I'd like to share with you this number that we talk about, the white paper, the population white paper. It's always been there. It's always part of the planning parameter. If in fact we look at the concept plan since 1971, already at that time, the population was 2.0. And the population assumption at the then prevailing concept plan was assuming 3.4. Right? And in 1990, our population was 3 million. And the concept plan at that time was preparing itself for 4.0 million. And in 2000, with a population base of 4 million, we're talking about a 5.5 million population in 40 to 50 years' time. So this is not new. This 2012 white paper is just part and parcel of the planner's parameter. In order to plan the city in the long term, they need to know who am I dealing with, what is the possible scenarios that I need to work with. So it was 6.5 to 6.9 was what they use as a planning parameter. Please do not go away thinking that this is a population target. I've outlined to you earlier, the population number depends on a lot of factors. Where the fertility rate is for Singapore, if the indigenous population doesn't reproduce enough, then we need to balance off. To what extent are we balancing off? Is it a dependency ratio of 35% or lower or higher? Do you want to have more emphasis, more weight on Singaporeans working, the economic group active here in Singapore? Do you have to shoulder a heavier burden, or do you want to reduce the burden? So all that factors come into play. It's not just a simple 6.5, 6 point, therefore go by now. This is not as simple as that, right? So this is just a word of caution that this is only a planning parameter. It's for long-term planning. It is not a target. And the state has also mentioned in recent press releases that they are reviewing this whole number again in consultation with all the public feedbacks. They are reviewing that number. So this is, again, it's only for planning purposes. What I'd like to share with you next is more critical. What is the impact on the real estate? Like I mentioned earlier, yes, real estate population number is driven fundamentally by population growth and economic growth. Of course, there are many other factors, political as well, but I've left that out for purpose of discussion today. If you look at other countries, look at Hong Kong, if you look at the grey bar, house price movement, GDP growth, and population growth, there seem to be some kind of relationship. Overall, it kind of grew alongside economic growth as well as population. London, same situation. New York as well, save for the global crisis that affected the demand and GDP growth in there. What I'm basically trying to share with you is that this relationship between property price, population, yes, it's direct correlation to some degree, it's more complex. It's not a simple direct relationship. In fact, in some studies in Asia, since studies have now, Asia is more developed, there are a lot more studies being done on how our cities behave. In the past, we were dependent on the Europeans and the American cities, the studies from that cities to help us guide ourselves. But this recent study I share with you here, they found that the relationship between population and economic growth is a bit mixed in Asia. In case of Philippines, China, and Singapore, yes, population growth supports economic growth, whereas in Malaysia and Hong Kong, economic growth actually caused population expansion. Whereas in Taiwan and Indonesia, there's hardly any evidence at all. But we know for certain that if you follow the urban studies, but just for your purpose, if you think about it, right, as I mentioned earlier, cities typically grow on the back of the rural population. We all know that right now, over 50% of the world's population are in the cities, live in the city, right? And that's because of the rural-urban migration. The rural poor move to the cities to support its growth, cheap labor, cheap resources. But there is also another fundamental reverse that I'll share with you later. There are other factors at play that we must be aware of. One of them is change in structure. In this white paper that the state has put out, its plan is to restructure the economy. So in addition to the population issues that we have to face, it's trying to restructure so that we can increase our productivity. The number of professionals, managers and engineers and technicians, those are PMET jobs, they call it, will grow from 850 to 1.25 million. Essentially means the ratio of PMET to non-PMT will increase from today's 1 to 1 is to 1.5. So that naturally will change. You have a lot more professionals and white-collar workers. Their housing preference will change. Their demand for housing in different locations will rise. They will demand for more new lifestyle products. That whole structure will affect the way the property market behaves, not just in the residential, but everything from a retail to industrial to the office. More office space required, more retail shopping required, more housing and more merit forms of housing is required. And of course, industrial as well will change because your structure of the economy will shift. The industrial that we know of today, we're going to go into details, I'll let my colleagues to speak on that, will also shift eventually as a result of this change. So this changing structure of the economy will have some long-term bearings on the market. So as I said, understand that this housing preference of a new generation of new PMTs in there. Okay, I'm going to be put it out of this hall soon. I'm going to have 10 minutes left. I'm done, almost done. So here is the situation. The preference of a new generation, you have kids growing up, you know that their concentration span is quite different from our time. It's multiple gadgets all at the same time, and you have no idea who they're talking to. Are they talking to me or they're talking to their friends? So it's that kind of dilemma, right? It's a new generation. Housing form would change. Will they take care of you when you're old? I don't know. You have to ask your kids whether they will take care of you eventually, or are you dependent on yourself? So all that preferences would change over time. The way housing would change as well. Higher expectations, a need for a varied housing forms. There is also a need to understand, that I alluded to earlier, of this other relationship, this bi-directional relationship between the city and the hinterland. In the beginning, I said that city grew on the back of cheap resources. Right? Population comes into the city, takes up blue-collar work, supports industries, provides a labor force for your service industries and whatnot. But over time, as the city matures, it's been found that as the city progresses and matures, it becomes a driving force for this outward movement, outward migration from the urban back to the rural area, what we call this urban growth, right? So the hinterlands now provides not only a low-cost resource, but a buffer environment where your urban dwellers can now move out to kind of spend up, to immigrate after having spending their productive years while they're actively producing for the economy. They now need to move out to a place where it's cheaper, more conducive for their retirement, or even for a reduced scope of work, so to speak, right? So it's this relationship that is happening, this bi-directional. Studies have shown that, in fact, there is such a correlation as cities mature. Oops. So the hinterland is no longer just to provide firms cheap locations. As we know, firms eventually, because of your central place theory, for those of you who know about that, right? That as firm competes for the city area, land prices rise. As they can't face the competition, they move out of the city. The industrialists will move further out into the suburbs. As land prices continue to rise, they will have to move further out. The suburbs, the hinterland, provides the opportunity, as likewise for households, for them to relocate. So the cities is pivotal. The growth of this city is pivotal on this availability of low resources for the rural to urban migration. And likewise, when it matures, it needs to feed them as well, the urban back to rural migration. So this is the dilemma for Singapore. While we have laid out lots of incentives for firms to move out to the hinterland, into cheaper locations, into the region, Southeast Asia region, but it's not so simple. The equation is not so simple for households like you and I. We can't just suka, just pack up and go, right? It's not so easy to move out your households to where the low jobs are. In other cities, it's easy. They will follow where the lower jobs are, the household population move out. In Singapore's situation, this churn is much slower. It's more difficult in Singapore. So again, this factor has a large part to play with the way the population number will grow over the next 15 to 18 years. So in conclusion, what I'm trying to share with you here today is this population number, for those who just forgotten, or just woken up, 6.9 is not a target. It is only a planning parameter. There are a lot of factors at play. We look at the indigenous population. Is fertility rate rising? Are we producing enough? If that's the case, then it's all right. Is the economically active group, is that population base growing because of either extended retirement or maybe earlier labor force, child labor, oh dear, that's terrible, right? Or extended retirement, right? If that population number grows, then the whole equation changes again, and productivity, of course. So it's a merit of factors: population, participation rate, retirement age, as well as imported labor. So 6.9 is not just a magical number, it's just only a planning parameter. So with that, I end my presentation, and I hand you back to the MC.